All right, guys, this is Mrs. Burnett. We are going to talk about cellular processes this evening. I know it says part two, and we haven't done part one, but that's okay. We're going to do them a little bit out of order. Objectives for this video is to be able to identify the major processes in a cell. And after that, you will be able to explain where and how cellular processes are carried out within a cell. So make sure you are taking your C notes. You may or may not have a quiz over this when you get to class. I will definitely still be checking your C notes, so make sure you get them done. All right, there are several processes that nearly all cell types must carry out in order to survive. As you can see, there's some parts of your screen that are kind of grayed out because we haven't talked about these yet. We will talk about these in a later lesson. But the parts at the bottom we will talk about. So this is the transport of molecules within and between the cell and its environment, and also maintaining homeostasis, which is the concentration of molecules in a stable pH. Appropriate concentrations of needed molecules and the stable pH contributes to the cell's abilities to maintain a stable internal condition, even in a cell's changing environment. So that's very important. Each of the major processes of a cell are carried out by specific cell organelles. Energy conversions occur in the chloroplast and the cytoplasm and the mitochondria. The nucleus, the ribosomes, and the endoplasmic reticulum are responsible for making new molecules. We are going to focus specifically on the transport of those molecules, which are mediated by the cytoplasm, the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi bodies, and the plasma membrane. The plasma membrane is also largely responsible for maintaining cellular homeostasis. So let's look at how that process. All right, so cells must have a way to transport needed molecules to their appropriate locations. So within a cell, the process of transport occurs in the cytoplasm, the endoplasmic reticulum, and the Golgi bodies, or the Golgi apparatus. You'll also see it called the Golgi complex. So all of those are the same thing. The plasma membrane is responsible for transporting molecules between the cell and its environment. So both types of transport are necessary to ensure that all of the other cellular processes occur correctly. So we have what is called intracellular transport, and this is the transport of molecules to different locations within the cell. Intracellular transport of some molecules occurs in the cell cytoplasm. Many molecules float freely within the cytoplasm. Other molecules are transported by motor proteins. Motor proteins are specialized to carry molecules throughout the cytoplasm. They accomplish this by walking, is kind of what we call it, along a network of microtubules that exist within the cell cytoplasm. So this animation kind of depicts the motor protein kinsine transporting a molecule along the length of a microtubule. The two feet-like molecules walking along the microtubule represent the kinsine protein, and the attached circle is the substance being transported. Other molecules travel to new locations within the cell through the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus. The endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus are both made up of a network of channels that direct the movement of various gases, nutrients, and waste products to different locations within the cell. All right, so molecules that need to enter or exit the cell must pass through the plasma membrane. Remember that the plasma membrane is a lipid bilayer composed of two layers of phospholipids. So due to the unique properties of this lipid bilayer, some molecules like water and small other molecules are able to pass freely between the cell and its environment. Others, like large molecules and ions, require assistance from proteins embedded in the membrane. The method of transport used by various molecules can be divided into two types: active transport and passive transport. We're going to talk about both of those. Passive transport is the process of moving molecules across the cell membrane without using any energy. There are 3 types of passive transport: diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis. These 3 types of movement all utilize concentration gradients to transport molecules into and out of the cell. All right, so concentration describes the amount of a substance in a unit of another substance. So I gave you the example of 50 milligrams of salt per liter of water. That means for every liter of water, there's 50 milligrams of salt. So concentration gradients describe the difference in concentration of a particular molecule between the inside and the outside of the cell. The net movement of molecules tends to be down a concentration gradient. This means that molecules tend to move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. The concentration gradient determines the direction that the molecules will move through the plasma membrane. So if you're looking here, you see how we have a higher concentration at the bottom and a lower concentration on top. So this higher concentration are going to move through our lipid bilayer. Okay, remember those lipids we've been talking about. They're going to move through this lipid bilayer and eventually try to reach a balance. And remember, that balance we've always talked about is homeostasis, and that's where everything wants to be. Diffusion is the net movement of molecules down a concentration gradient. In cells, this occurs through that phospholipid bilayer. Diffusion is the simplest form of cellular transportation. Molecules that utilize diffusion pass directly through that lipid bilayer. Most of these molecules are small and nonpolar. Examples of these molecules that are transported by diffusion are oxygen and carbon dioxide. So oxygen and carbon dioxide flow freely in and out of our cells, into our cells when we need them and out of our cells when they're carbon dioxide. Facilitated diffusion is the movement of molecules down a concentration gradient, but with the aid of membrane proteins. This type of passive transport is most often used by large molecules and ions because they are unable to pass directly through that lipid bilayer. Facilitated diffusion occurs with the help of ion channels and carrier proteins. Ion channels are membrane proteins that open and close to allow specific ions to pass through. Ions can move into or out of the cell through ion channels depending on the concentration gradient present. Remember that this type of facilitated diffusion does not need energy to occur because the molecules move down to the concentration gradient, so they're going to move in the direction of a lower concentration. Examples of molecules that are transported through ion channels are sodium and chlorine. So we get both of those from salt. So when you eat salt, some of that sodium and chlorine is broken up and it's going to go into your cells through this facilitated transport. Carrier proteins are membrane proteins that bind to specific large proteins. So they can change their shape to transport these molecules across the cell membrane. This type of movement also does not need energy to occur because they're moving down that concentration gradient. So examples of molecules that are transported through carrier proteins are glucose and amino acids. So this is that sugar and that amino acid protein that we talked about when we talked about biomolecules. That's how these get into the cells, are through these carrier proteins. So when we start talking about solutions and comparing them, they are compared by their concentration. If the two are equal, they are both considered isotonic. If a solution is more concentrated, it is considered hypertonic. And if it's less concentrated, the solution is hypotonic. Osmosis is the movement of water molecules from a less concentrated to a more concentrated solution. In cells, osmosis occurs by the diffusion of a water molecule directly through that lipid layer. So water is going to move from a hypotonic to a hypertonic solution. So it's going to pass directly through that lipid layer. All right, so hypotonic environments, which is right here in this picture, causes water to leave the cell. Hypotonic environments cause water to diffuse into the cell, leading to the cell swelling and possibly rupturing. So that means there's a lot of water in the environment and not as much water into the cell. So water is going to flow into the cell to try to make them equal. This could cause that cell to, it will cause it to swell, could cause it to burst. So hypertonic relationships cause water to diffuse out of the cell, so leading to cell shriveling and possibly a loss of function. So if there's not enough water around the cell will try to pump water into the environment, losing its own water. So cells function best when the environment is isotonic and there's no net movement of water into or out of the cell. Okay, some of it will flow in and out, but it'll be in equal amounts. Active transport is a process of moving molecules across the cell membrane by using energy in the form of ATP. There are two types of active transports, ion pumps and co-transport. These two types of movement both utilize the membrane proteins to transport molecules against their concentration gradients. The ion pump is a membrane protein that pumps ions one way against the ion's concentration gradient. ATP provides energy needed from the membrane protein to change its shape in order to transport the ions across the membrane. An example of a molecule that is transported by the ion pump is sodium ion. Sodium ions are transported out of the cell to be used in co-transport, which is another type of active transport. So co-transport is the coupled passage of two molecules through a membrane. The first molecule is usually an ion, such as hydrogen or sodium. This molecule is usually paired with another ion or large molecule like sugar or amino acid. As the ion is moved down its concentration gradient, the second molecule is moved up or against its concentration gradient. There are two types of cotransport, symport and antiport. Symport is the cotransport of two molecules in the same direction, either in or out of the cell. So an example of symport is sodium and sugar. First, sodium ions are pumped outside of the cell against their gradients. Both molecules bind to the same protein on the outside of the cell, and then sodium passes down its concentration gradient through the transport protein. At the same time, sugar is also allowed to enter the cell against its concentration gradient. All right, so antiport is a cotransport of two molecules in the opposite directions. One molecule enters the cell while the other exits. An example of antiport is sodium and calcium. Both molecules bind to the same transport protein, but sodium ions bind on the outside of the cell and calcium binds on the inside. Sodium ions will pass down its concentration gradient through the transport protein. At the same time, calcium is allowed to exit the cell against its concentration gradient. So why is all of this important? Homeostasis. Homeostasis is the ability of a cell to maintain stable internal conditions independent of the conditions that exist in the outside environment. A cell accomplishes this largely by maintaining the appropriate concentrations of needed molecules and a stable pH. Remember, this is like acid and base levels. The plasma membrane is the main organelle responsible for maintaining cellular homeostasis. Passive and active transport of needed molecules across the plasma membrane allows the cell to maintain appropriate concentrations of these molecules. Molecules that are especially important for carrying out cellular processes are water, glucose, and then certain ions. The co-transport of sugars is an example of how transport across the plasma membrane helps maintain homeostasis. Remember that symport of sodium and sugars allows sugars to enter the cell against their concentration gradient. This process ensures that the cell has an adequate supply of sugars to carry out the essential processes of cellular respiration, regardless of the concentration of sugars in the environment. A stable pH is necessary to ensure that chemical reactions vital to the cell's survival can occur. Carbonic acid is a buffer molecule that helps the cell maintain this stable pH. Carbonic acid is formed with a reaction of carbon dioxide and water. When we talk about cellular respiration, you'll learn that carbon dioxide and water are both byproducts of aerobic cellular respiration. And we need these to help maintain our pH. So this isn't a huge deal for you right now, but it will be for you later. All right, so that's the end. If you have any questions, as I'm sure you do, go ahead and write them down and we'll answer them in class. And we're going to be talking about all of these types of transports this week in class. So I will see you guys later. Have a great day.